Dan Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at danieldrezner.com.
And I'm Heather Hurlburt, Executive Director of the National Security Network in Washington, D.C., and I blog somewhat infrequently at democracyarsenal.org. And welcome back to another Drezner-Hurlburt Blogging Heads edition. We haven't come up with a catchy name for ourselves yet, Daniel.
That's true, like Turner and Hooch or Tango and Cash or something like that. We got Cagney and Lacey. We got to. We'll leave it to the editors of Blogging Heads. Hopefully a natural, title will come up from this. Yeah, I think this is a great sort of contest for the comment section. That's excellent. All right, so to the commenters of this Blogging Heads, come up with a two-name, a catchphrase for our dynamic duo. Right, and we will give a shout out to the winner on our next. I like it. That's good. Appearance. That's very good. So I was apologizing to Daniel that you can't tell this because time stands still in Blogging Heads land, but I have kept him waiting for 25 minutes as I wrestled with my staff on how to distill all that has been happening in Mumbai and all of its broader ramifications into a 2-page product for our howling audience. Which raises the question of how do we understand what has just happened and what it's going to mean. It's one of those events that is, I think, actually going to shape much more going forward than is immediately apparent, and whose maybe biggest ramifications are not going to be in Mumbai and possibly not even in India, as harsh as that sounds and as unfair as it is to the hundreds of personal tragedies involved. Right. But that this is something that really has the potential to profoundly reshape and profoundly reshape what the United States is able to do in the region. So you really think this is a 9/11 style, significance in terms, at least at the regional level? I think it has the potential to have 9/11 significance at the regional level, depending on how the various governments respond. And one of the really fiendish geniuses of the attack is that the relevant governments are all in a position where it will be extraordinarily hard for them to respond in non-predictable ways. Mm-hmm. The Indian government was already unpopular, facing elections in 2009, already under fire for not having responded more strongly to previous terror attacks in India this year, which were also very devastating, but frankly didn't get so much attention because they were primarily focused on Indian victims. This was actually, just to pause here, this was a thing that strikes me about this. I will admit, the attention of these attacks caught me a little bit by surprise, because this is hardly the first terrorist attack in India. There was an attack on the parliament, if memory serves, a couple of years ago. But this is clearly, a whole order of magnitude higher in terms of the attention. Yeah. Well, I think, a couple of things. Number one is people who are reporting the news and people like us who are consumers of the news are also people who travel around the world and stay in those hotels and go to those cafes. Right. So there's a way, and there's this whole interesting debate going on, which I don't pretend to know the answer to, as to how much this was intended to target Westerners. And it seems, some people in India are very offended, and I think rightly so, that the initial attention was given to the supposed targeting of British and American citizens, where in fact one of the first things that happened was that the gunmen went into the central railway station and just sort of sprayed bullets at everybody. Yeah. And that at one of the hotels you had kind of a wholesale killing of chef trainees, which certainly has a horrible personal impact but does nothing for international relations. So I think those complaints are valid. At the same time, you don't go and target a Lubavitch Center unless you're trying to get international attention. Yeah. So there's clearly multiple motives here, and as I say, one of them is it'll very conveniently destabilize the Indian government and is quite likely to contribute to the demise of the Congress Party government and its replacement by a much more hardline pro-Hindu BJP government, which will further stress Muslim-Hindu relations within India. So that's one piece. But also, and I think this has it was noticed immediately and then maybe hasn't been paid enough attention to, the potential harm this does to India's progress in attaining a greater and greater role on the world stage. And if you think about Indian leadership in the G20, on the economic crisis, India's ability to play a very constructive role in Afghanistan, which I'll come back to in a second, you have to ask whether this is going to have impacts on that as well. You had, some kind of inching progress in a India-Pakistan peace process. You had Zardari in Pakistan just having made an overture to
to India, suggesting, it was unclear how serious this was, but it was good, always better to see than not, suggesting that Pakistan could adopt a no first use policy, which would have been a historic break with Pakistan's traditional insistence that because it was the smaller weaker neighbor, it had to retain a first-use policy, or first-use option, I should say. But, it's hard to see, the Indian government is under incredible pressure to point the finger at Islamabad, regardless of what the facts turn out to be, or what the facts of actual government involvement turn out to be, which are very murky and, frankly, likely to stay that way. And then you have the problem of if Pakistan is then disrupted by that, it can't pay attention to al-Qaeda, so that you then have pressure coming off al-Qaeda on two different fronts. So, which of those was the intention of the attackers and which is a felicitous side effect for them, it's hard to say.
Yeah. Although, I have to say, that, sort of couple of thoughts I have. First of all, one of the problems you have is that when you talk about whether or not the Pakistani government was responsible, that's giving way too much credit to Pakistan.
Right, true.
The single use, the singular use of government, it really should be Pakistani governments. Was it the democratically elected government? Is it the ISI, which is probably the group much more closely affiliated with the Kashmiri extremists? So part of the problem is, the situation of to what extent, which Pakistani institution are you negotiating with? The concern about al-Qaeda, I'm less worried about, in the sense that I don't think they were affiliated with this. It's not their style exactly. And furthermore, one would assume that al-Qaeda was media savvy enough to not attack Westerners right in the middle of Thanksgiving, which automatically blunted the extent to which Americans were actually paying attention to these sorts of things. Although it might be evidence that al-Qaeda has become so networked, and by networked I mean so decentralized, that actually the leadership doesn't have any control over the timing of these kinds of attacks.
Well, I think you ask yourself, I'm not actually sure that this resulted in less attention, because you have an awful lot of people who normally wouldn't be paying attention but were sort of home from work watching their TVs.
Yeah, they were watching football.
I can only speak, where there was a little crawl. Who was it was telling me that he was watching a soccer match, which I suppose already makes him suspect in the Thanksgiving context.
Oh, come on, that's socialist.
And, but the crawl on the crawl was all about the attack. So I don't know, but I do think the Al-Qaeda networking is a valid point. Yeah. And so you have to consider whether, and I think the speculation around Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is not Al-Qaeda, and it's correct to say that it's not Al-Qaeda, but it also appears, people who know more about it than I do say, to have developed a pretty good working relationship, if you will, with Al-Qaeda. And so this is certainly something that doesn't hurt Al-Qaeda, I think, and this is sort of what I meant by the ripples of consequences, that it's going to make it harder to put more pressure on Al-Qaeda. And so it benefits them whether or not the levers are being pulled by bin Laden from some cave somewhere.
I don't know. I mean, there was a great article in the fall issue of International Security about this notion of Al-Qaeda as a networked actor, pointing out that one of the arguments is that particularly post 9/11, Al-Qaeda became more networked, and the implication subtly was this made them more fluid, more ability, more nimble, easier to take action. But in point of fact, it also means that Al-Qaeda loses control over some of its constituent parts, and then in fact suggesting that it's not nearly as powerful as people thought it once was. It's not. I mean, I take your point that the pressure might that attack on India might somehow alleviate attention off Al-Qaeda. But correct me if I'm wrong. One of the really tricky points on this whole crisis right now is that the Bush administration has either gotten de facto or de jure permission from the Pakistani government to launch predator attacks on the other side of Pakistan, where Al-Qaeda is based. And it's clear that this is having some kind of an effect on Al-Qaeda's leadership. So presumably, the U.S. is stuck in a very awkward situation because they don't want to pressure the Pakistani government on this, since they've gotten what they want. I mean, that creates some interesting fissures, potentially, but I'm assuming that the U.S. is going to continue to launch these attacks regardless of what happens between India and Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, it does. The sort of worry scenario is that you have, if things ratchet up between India and Pakistan, you have Pakistan redeploying troops from the tribal areas down toward India. Then what does that do toward the confidence level, which has, as you say, there appears to be a deal where the U.S. won't admit to the drone attacks, and the Pakistani government will criticize them.
Right.
But does this make that tenable for the Pakistani government to continue? And I think nobody really knows. Just back on the networking point for a second, I think a point that gets lost is Al-Qaeda didn't become networked because it wanted to. It became networked because it had to.
Absolutely.
And that I think is some part of what you're getting at. That it's not like they went out and looked around and said, okay, now that we've pulled off the 9/11 attack, the next thing we should do is transform ourselves. No, it was because they didn't have an alternative.
I do like the image of like Al-Qaeda sitting around a conference table and some management consultant coming in and saying, "You got to get networked. That's the next move."
Right, but so it's the thing I think to take away from it is that they were put by the fast U.S. move into Afghanistan.
Yeah.
They were put in a very weak position,
right.
But they proved both very resilient and very able to kind of read the 21st century and harness the technology and strengths that were still available to them in a way that, on the one hand, they lose control. On the other hand, they get credit when something like this happens in a sort of perverse way.
Yeah.
And it makes it possible for bin Laden to continue pursuing his aims. And it encourages, in a way, the problem with it is, as people have called it, the franchise model.
Yeah.
Is that it gives sort of a groups of malcontents in other places something to strive for.
That's true.
Which is highly problematic for the West.
No, that's a fair point. Which is it does give a template. Although it should be pointed out that these attacks, there are ways in which they don't bear Al-Qaeda's stamp. Among other things, they weren't suicide attacks.
Yes. No. This is. One of the things that I'm sort of trying to watch the expert discourse on, because I don't even want to pretend that this is what I spend my days thinking about.
Me neither.
Does this represent the emergence of a new group that we haven't seen before?
Right.
Or does this represent learning, and is this a modality that we're going to... And, the thing that occurs to me is that, in point of fact, Al-Qaeda, the big spectacular attacks have very rarely been the same thing multiple times. Mm-hmm. So to me, the ability to evolve and come up with new things that we scratch our head and say, gee, that doesn't look like Al-Qaeda, is exactly one of the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. But as I say, this is a debate I'm very much watching from the sidelines.
No, that's fair. Let me ask you a question. I agree that you're absolutely correct, I think, in your assessment of the domestic weakness of all the major actors involved. India's Congress Party is very weak, Pakistan's democratic government is weak, and, we're in a state of transition. Do you think, can you turn this weakness into strength? One could make the argument that both the Congress Party and Pakistan's government do have an incentive to cooperate, not only because it's obviously in their national interest, because there is a national interest in doing so, but if they can somehow demonstrate some sort of show of solidarity or some show of cooperation, it also would potentially boost their domestic popularity.
Well, I think the first thing to be said is that actually so far, and I haven't checked the news in a couple of hours, so I risk being grossly wrong by the time anyone has said
We always
this.
do that when we do these things.
But with the time zone and my awareness that our news sources from that part of the world are not as good as they should be, I'm even more acutely aware of my fallibility than usual, which metaphysically I suppose is a good thing.
Uh-huh.
But in fact, the Pakistani government has done pretty much everything you would have wanted it to do.
Right.
In terms of offering to send people, in terms of denouncing the attacks, in terms of keeping the senior minister in India after the attacks, and has sent lots of positive signals. The Indian government has come out with some strong rhetoric, but given what's just happened, not unreasonably strong.
Yeah.
Has not made any sort of overtly aggressive steps yet. And the third thing that I think is a really good sign is that, again, at least as of last night, the situation in Kashmir has stayed quiet.
Right.
Which I think is a pleasant surprise, and it also, to me, suggests that the direct link to Kashmir is somewhat spurious.
Right, because you would have expected some sort of coordination between the attacks in Mumbai and potentially an uptick in violence in Kashmir.
Right,
Yeah.
and that hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, you have Kashmir as one of these kind of underlying grievances. Mm-hmm. Which clearly helps motivate people, but it doesn't look like it was directly connected. So I think the first answer to your question is to say that, in fact, everybody is doing fairly well so far.
It could be a lot worse.
It could be a lot worse, and it could get a lot worse. Mm-hmm. The question of whether that provides an uptick in support in either country, it's really unclear to me in the Indian context because, as I said, there is this specific feeling that the Singh government was soft on terrorism after the summer attacks, and as more and more comes out that suggests that the government was warned in advance. Mm-hmm. The little throwaway line that I found particularly amazing was in a Washington Post story yesterday with the Indian government official noting that the attackers had come ashore in a slum area and that it had never occurred to them to put security in slum areas.
Yeah, that's a bit of a whopper.
Evocative to me, but so I think, and again, this isn't my normal area of expertise, but from what you read, it looks as if the government was already in trouble, mm-hmm. that the public had already made up its mind that the government was not delivering.
Right.
And so your likelihood in being able to turn that around seems pretty low to me.
That's a fair assessment. Although I have to say it was refreshing that they actually had a minister resign over this.
Mm-hmm.
There's something to be said for. I mean, he was admittedly, my understanding. And again, I like you, I do not have a great deal of expertise in the region. But my understanding is he was politically unpopular anyway.
Yeah.
Prior to this, so in some ways it's a convenient out. But it does allow. Again, it is an interesting and encouraging thing. I think the other encouraging thing, is my understanding at least, is that Mumbai is trying to get back to business relatively quickly.
I was just going to say it's a really interesting study in how different large, diverse democracies deal with these kinds of things. Yeah. That I heard a radio piece on Sunday already that sort of people were back thronging through the train station as if nothing had happened, except that there were more police there.
Right.
Than usual. And I actually just coincidentally have been working on a project lately on looking at managing fear. And, in fact, the psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists say that that's a much more healthy response. Mm-hmm. Being able to sort of continue to operate your society.
Yeah.
And not becoming so traumatized that every time you visit the place, it's an opportunity to revisit the trauma all over again.
Right. No, in some ways it is the. I mean, you're right. It's the best way to defeat the terrorists. If you let the fear. Yeah, I mean, this is cliche, but it's true. If you let the fear take over, the terrorists do win.
Yeah.
And it goes back to this notion that you presumably in some ways the existential way to defeat terrorism is to treat it as a problem similar to crime, in the sense of to acknowledge that these kinds of attacks, while obviously you want to prevent them, might on occasion take place.
Yep.
However, just because they take place, you do not shut society down. You do not alter the way in which you live. You do not, compromise the rule of law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and the other point which comes along with that is that societies that have dealt with these attacks for a long time have a mythology about themselves as successfully going on living through them.
Right, enduring, yeah.
Yeah, so that, for example, apparently the whole British stiff upper lip in World War II thing actually is somewhat less true in the World War II context than we might have been led to believe, but it's now so internalized by subsequent generations that you can just evoke it. And people say, "Oh yes, right, stiff upper lip. We have to go on about our business." And
so in truth, they were actually wusses about the whole thing. Is what you're saying.
Well, I wasn't going to go that far. There's a guy named Peter Starnes at George Mason who's written a book called American Fear, in which he went back and looked at personal histories that were taken after Pearl Harbor, and contrasted sort of 300 personal narratives of people talking about where they were when they heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed and how they felt, and comparing them to personal narratives after 9/11. And he says what's really noteworthy is in not a single one of the Pearl Harbor narratives does anyone reference personal fear. And he says, there was this is going to be hard for us, but we're going to do it. And, to think about how the culture has shifted, and he goes into a bunch of explanations for this. Some are kind of psychological, some have to do with advertising and
Oprah Winfrey gets mentioned, doesn't she?
Actually, no, because he argues that the big shift took place. For example, fear wasn't used by and large in political advertising up through the 60s, the first big exception being the famous Lyndon Johnson Daisy ad. And then that changes in the 70s, and I don't know where you grew up, but the whole sort of in the 70s, things emerging and all of us being sort of encouraged to fear our personal environment at all times.
Yes.
The classic example being the whole myth of poison and razor blades in Halloween candy.
Oh, yes. No, I remember that.
Which but apparently there's no actual documented instances of that.
What?
Of strangers being given poison.
I'm calling my mother after this thing, and I'm bitching to her like you wouldn't believe about the amount of candy that I could have eaten that was denied by my mother. Although I will say in defense, if I remember correctly, the thing that triggered that was not just the razor blade urban myth, but also the Tylenol incident in the early 80s.
Yeah, but by that time we also started to have the cable news coverage so that any bad incident, like the Tylenol thing, you're subjected to 100 times over and over and over, like, seeing the videos of Virginia Tech or the videos of the Mumbai Jewish Center over and over and over, which trauma specialists say is a good way to kind of really etch and sear the thing into your brain. So,
and that's true. I mean, I would say it doesn't shock me that, I have to think the biggest difference between Pearl Harbor and 9/11 was that Pearl Harbor, no one watched it on television.
Yep, that's another excellent point.
Yeah. At best you saw the movie tone news and stuff. But you're right. So hopefully, hopefully India can learn from, our example or bad example and soldier on.
Well, I'm hoping we can learn from our example.
Exactly, yes. No, I agree. Well, I think, paradoxically, this might be the one benefit that 9/11, I think, gives the United States, which is, simply put, I don't know if Al-Qaeda can top it. It is, admittedly, one can envision scenarios where they might be able to, but I have to think that one of the reasons why we haven't had an attack on the U.S. since 9/11 is the fact that if they come up with anything that is not seen as big as 9/11, Americans can go, okay, yeah, so what?
Yeah, terrorism experts actually say that in part, I don't know how much because of Americans' reaction or how much because of bin Laden's own views about how he acts in the world, that anything that was done here would have to top it.
Right.
So yeah, well, I don't know that I really want to take that as a plus, but I guess I will.
You got to look on the you got to look on the positive side.
Mm-hmm. But it does cycle us around a little bit to the other question we had on our agenda today, which is the domestic side of American foreign affairs. That the fascinating thing is that this has I spent most of last week talking to people who basically said to me, "Oh, we're not going to have anything to do on foreign affairs for the next couple of months. It's all going to be economy and stimulus all the time, and it's really nice to see you, but don't expect us to have any time to pay attention to you." And this changes that to some extent. Not that I mean to sound pleased about it or anything.
You're back in business.
Well, it's fascinating how the news cycle drives things, and the urgent drives out the important, drives out the other urgent.
Well, this ties into the fact. In some ways, it was also coincidentally timed, but Barack Obama, yesterday unfurled his national security team, and as the head of a progressive national security group, I have to ask you, Heather, has the mantra of your, network changed from "yes, we can" to "oh, no, he didn't"?
Well, the mantra of our network is there's one president and they're his policies. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things that I find really fascinating, well, there's actually two things. And one is that my communications director pointed out to me this morning that there's now a story in the mainstream media about the left being angry about cabinet appointments, but if you actually go around the blogs, there's not really very much new about the left being mad about cabinet appointments. That, people sort of had their storm of anxiety 10 days ago, and they've now, by and large, gotten over it and said, okay, he's the president, we elected him, let's wait and see what he does, which I think is But now the story has made its way to the mainstream media, which has now decided that the left is up in arms, just as, frankly, the left decided to move on and focus on issues. So that's kind of a funny side note to the whole thing. But I have been a little bit bemused. The guy thumped his opponents in the primaries, including Senator Clinton and Senator Biden.
Right.
The guy won a very convincing national electoral majority. Mm-hmm. He very eloquently put forward a set of foreign policy priorities and an approach to the world. So, and the folks the president-elect has appointed to be the managers and enforcers of his national security team are just not people who are going to let a whole lot of dissent and running around behind people's backs go on. So why anybody is worried that people are somehow going to be subverting the president's agenda is a little mystifying to me. You know, that the whole message of Rahm Emanuel and of Jim Jones is, you know, we are actually going to be an organized administration and policy is going to be made through channels. And as Obama said in the press conference yesterday, I'm going to be the one who makes the decisions.
And Heather, I'm laughing. Not that I disagree with you, but have you seen, it was a web video that Saturday Night Live put together, Andy Samberg, of pretending to be Rahm Emanuel?
No, but I clearly need to, and we clearly need to link to it.
It will be linked, but basically it was Rahm Emanuel as, you know, the hammer. It was just very, very funny. The indication of, you know, I'm not going to tolerate people stabbing me in the back on this sort of thing. I mean, more substantively, I think the reason you're seeing this sort of thing is largely, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and we know these same sorts of people, and I've heard it from some people who worked on Obama's campaign, is a lot of foreign policy people that worked on Obama's campaign took a risk in doing so. Because the message they got, I mean, you know, flashback 18 months, Hillary Clinton was the considered to be the front runner. A lot of these people, you know, were not big fans of Hillary, and also got the impression that a lot of the big feet, you know, like Richard Holbrooke or Sandy Berger were going to be running that show. They took a risk in going to Barack Obama's team with the implicit quid pro quo that in doing so, they would then have a major voice in foreign affairs after the election, should he win. Now, he won. And in the end, what's happened is that Hillary Clinton has been made Secretary of State, and furthermore, the implicit contract, you know, apparently seems to be that Hillary gets to choose her own staff. So it wouldn't shock me if there are people that are disgruntled about this.
Well, I mean, there's two things, and one is that the division that happened was that there were, you know, the sort of very senior folks that you cited that were very identified with Hillary,
right.
And then there were a number of very, very smart, talented folks who said, you know, hey, I've spent, you know, who both maybe didn't feel that closely identified with Senator Clinton,
yeah.
And liked the idea of being able to have a bigger, more visible role with Senator Obama. And
this was also a generational thing. I mean, these people are mostly people our age at this point, frankly.
Yes, frankly, it was mostly an older generation that did, you know, feel very personally committed to Senator Clinton, and younger folks that didn't so much.
Yeah.
And now, you know, the Obama folks have decided they want people who have experience in senior management positions.
Right.
And so I think that's some of the angst, and also, you know, some of the angst is that, you know, after sort of 8 years out of power, there's a real just a backlog. Mm-hmm. And all of us who were, you know, in our 20s in the Clinton administration, you know, now think we should have sort of the next tier of jobs above us.
Exactly.
The folks who were in their 40s now think they should have a very senior tier of jobs. But, oh, by the way, there are all the folks who are in their 20s and 30s who, you know, were out sleeping on the floor in Montana who think they've earned the jobs as well. Yeah. So you just have kind of an inevitable crush, and there's a pyramid of jobs that's pretty skinny. As this gets a little inside baseball, but there are only 30 slots that you can appoint to on the National Security Council, for example. And you know, with the much reported statistic about Obama having 300 foreign policy advisors, you know, that's a ratio equivalent with the kind of selective college ratios that we all faced, you know, 20, 30, however many years ago.
Yes.
Not everybody can get on the NSC, and everybody has spent the last months or years thinking about what they have to offer on the NSC, and that's, you know, painful and disappointing, and it's, you know, it's somewhat less painful if you can blame it on somebody else.
That's true. That's true. I have to say, from a personal standpoint, I'm really delighted about this phase, because I don't know about you, since I really don't have any ambitions to serve in the Obama administration, what I've noticed is there's been an interesting vacuum in terms of commentary by anyone who desperately wants to be on the Obama administration.
Yes.
And since all those people are declining the op-eds or various other opportunities, they're coming to me, which is just great. So I'd like to thank everyone and, you know, tell you, just hold on, it's going to happen. You know, and you know, even if you don't have something by January 20th, still wait and don't comment on anything, because it still could happen over the first 6 months of the administration. I mean, you got to be patient there.
Yeah, no, what you're saying is completely true. As we at NSN have also, frankly, been trying to fill the void in terms of putting out a daily policy product, and on the grounds that there are new members of Congress and new staff and advocacy organizations and all the engines that make up the totality of the progressive movement still need to be out there, and in some ways need to be out there even more, explaining what the heck, why the heck it is that Obama would choose to do policy X instead of policy Y.
Right.
That actually that need, in a way, only gets greater. And this, I think, is the other kind of great underappreciated sociological dynamic of all of this. That all of us for the last 8 years have gotten wonderfully used to living in a negative oppositional culture. And, we could get our op-eds published and we could get our TV time and get our organizations famous by writing the best possible critiques of how bad things were and coming up with the most creative ways of going after people we didn't like.
Right. You had to choose, what was the historical period that we have not seen a worst example of currently since then? How far back do you have to go till you find someone as bad as the Bush administration?
Right. And now, whereas now we, I was thinking about this, and the metaphor I came up with was kind of, many of us went through a phase in our 20s where sort of children were sort of other people's nuisance, and you mostly thought about them in terms of how they were disrupting your peace and quiet in the airplane or the cafe or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And then suddenly you have your own child, and it's all reversed.
Yes.
And, you may think that your child is being a brat, but nobody else is allowed to think that. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to tell your child they're being a brat, there's a kind of gentle interior way that you're going to do it. Mm-hmm. And there's a respect in which we're all now in the process of making the transition to realizing that, this administration is collectively our baby. We worked for it. We voted for it. And it may not always delight us, but just taking a purely oppositional tack to it is not the most effective way. Yelling at your friends is less effective and feels less good than yelling at people who aren't your friends.
That's true.
So, there's a learning curve going on. And also, people are so resolved. I think the thing that's really good is that people across the spectrum are so resolved to be smarter about this than we were in 92, 93. That, the folks in the administration and the transition are resolved, to learn from the mistakes that were made. And folks outside are saying, hey, actually, there needs to continue to be a strong presence outside and a smart presence outside. And I think the same on the Hill. I should actually say that you really see, an effort to figure out what the smart role there is.
Well, I would even suggest on the Republican side that, one of the nice things is, in part, I think in response to some of the people Obama has picked, is that you've seen a lot of, establishment Republicans sort of, suggesting we want to cooperate with the administration. Richard Lugar indicating already he's probably going to vote for Hillary Clinton. These kinds of signals are also positive.
So there's one other thing I want to circle back and say, actually, and we'll put up some links about this. But if you are sort of sitting at home feeling a little queasy about the cabinet or just a little sort of odd,
yes.
There's an Eric Holder video of a speech he gave at the American Constitution Society this past July, which is just a wonderful thumping denunciation of the Bush administration on international rule of law and justice issues. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a transcript. It's only video, but which you'll really enjoy. There's a whole reams of stuff Senator Clinton did, being early to denounce torture on the floor of the Senate, talking about George Washington's order not to torture British troops. Mm-hmm. There's a whole sort of range of wonderful things people have had to say about Janet Napolitano. So if you want to go out and look for reasons to feel good about these folks, I strongly recommend it. David Korn wrote a nice piece about Jim Jones. So there's lots out there. If you're not sure whether to feel good or not, there's lots out there to sort of help you recapture that happy buzz feeling.
Well, and I'll close with one more optimistic note, which is I actually think David Sanger for the Times wrote a really smart piece yesterday, pointing out that if once you get beyond the biography and the sort of past histories of a lot of these people, that a lot of Obama's national security team actually has relatively common positions on the notion of expanding, American soft power as opposed to American hard power. The notion that the military has been tasked to do way too much, that in fact, the State Department and other civilian foreign policy agencies need to shoulder more responsibility and presumably shoulder more resources, which actually touches back on a theme I think we talked about back in the spring, which is I want to see the State Department become even more bloated. That we need to have a much bigger, civilian foreign policy bureaucracy. that actually creates domestic constituencies to support it. But among other things, that this is a way for, to put America's best foot forward. So, beyond the motto of bloat, baby, bloat, we would also presumably, for all those 20-somethings, sleeping on the floors in Montana, there might actually be jobs available for them. If the State Department expands, in the same way that you've heard Gates or Clinton or Obama suggest that they want to see it expanded, then there might actually be jobs for these people after all.
So the great news on that, by the way, is that Congress is actually interested in making that happen, and that you're actually going to be pushing with Berman on the House side and presumably Kerry on the Senate side, and also the leadership, both Reid and Pelosi, are really interested in trying, even in a perilous economic climate, to find ways to do that. So if you're looking for a cause to bend your local representative's ear about, this is a good one.
Yes, no, and in fact, if anything, the Economic Times, given the need for a massive stimulus, this is actually one way, presumably, which you could do it. So, again, bloat, baby, bloat.
Okay, and on that note, we pack you off to your 12:15 class and me to my lunch, and our viewers to come up with cutesy names for us.
Yes, please do so. Pleasure as always, Heather.
Yep.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.